you will know how to make an incredible cauliflower pizza crust. Without any flour in it, it's completely gluten-free. Second, you're going to know how to flip really tricky foods with the technique I call the Potter's method. And third, we're going to throw in a little bit of a bonus here while we're waiting for that crust to cook a little bit. And we're going to make something called a shrub, which is a very nice, bright, non-alcoholic cocktail that you can make that's perfect for the summertime. So without further ado, the very first step you need to do is preheat your oven to 375 degrees. Get that going now before you take any of your ingredients out, before we take any other steps. Mine's already there, that's why you can hear it beeping. So we are going to need cauliflower. You can either buy a big head of cauliflower, chop off the greens, and run it through a food processor to get riced cauliflower, or just buy frozen riced cauliflower. Frozen, raw, either way, it doesn't really matter. But you want about 1.5 pounds, which is going to be 24 ounces. Some recipes call for 1 pound. That's not enough. Others call for 2 pounds. That just seems like too much in the end product. So 1.5 pounds is just about right. You're going to need 1 large egg. You want about a teaspoon of your favorite dry Italian-ish seasoning. I say ish because you could use an Italian seasoning. You could use thyme. You could use basil. You could use oregano. You can kind of use whatever you've got in the pantry. And that's going to add a little bit of flavor to our crust. We are going to use a little bit of salt, 1/4 teaspoon of salt, 1/4 teaspoon black pepper, 1 heaping half cup of mozzarella cheese that we're going to shred up a little bit here. When you buy mozzarella, buy it in a brick. Buy it in a brick like this, and you'll get higher quality cheese, and it won't already be coated in a lot of things that make it, 1, not great for you, and 2, it doesn't melt well. The pre-shredded mozzarella just doesn't melt as well as if you bought a brick and shredded it yourself. And then the last ingredient here is we're actually going to be using a little bit of tapioca powder. 1 tablespoon of tapioca powder is going to be added to this mix. Now that tapioca powder helps keep things a little bit drier. It also helps improve the browning on our crust, so we get a little bit more flavor and also looks a little more appetizing. The toppings then are just whatever you want. Red sauce, more cheese, pepperoni, sausage, mushrooms, jalapenos. We're going to get started right away to keep things moving. And the first step here is take out 1 big baking sheet, throw a sheet of parchment paper on top, and put your riced cauliflower on top of that. And we're going to throw that into your preheated oven, put it in for 25. After about 15 minutes, we're going to stir it and then let it go back in for another 10. Okay, so tip with your cauliflower, if you buy it frozen, it's going to have these big hard chunks. And we want this set out really nice and smooth. So while it's still in the bag, scratch it down a bit. We're just trying to get rid of any of the big lumps. This bag is already 24 ounces, which is a nice little convenience here. If your riced cauliflower is not frozen, you probably want to put it in for closer to 20 minutes rather than 25. The extra 5 minutes here helps make up the difference for frozen cauliflower. And what we're doing when we bake this is we are trying to get this to a state where we can get as much moisture out. What we're trying to do is get this to a state where we can easily knock the moisture out of this, or rather squeeze the moisture out later on. So a little bit of baking helps us do that. It also releases some of the moisture in the form of steam. So just spread that out, throw that into your 375 degree oven and set a timer for 15 minutes. You already know we need at least 1 big baking sheet. You already saw that. But the most important piece of equipment is actually a towel. But you want a big, thin, like a tea towel or a flour sack towel or some cheesecloth folded over a few times. The towel's going to give you a little bit more strength though. That's going to work better. And the reason we need this is because later we're going to put our cauliflower inside this towel, squeeze it up, twist it up, and squeeze and wring as much moisture as we can out of that cauliflower. So we want something really nice and strong. We're going to be using a little bit of muscle there to make it happen. And the towel is absolutely critical to this. After your tea towel, you're going to want 1 to 2 large mixing bowls. That's just where we mix everything together. That's how we're going to squeeze our moisture out. You want 2 sheets of parchment paper. We're going to use 1 at the beginning here. It's going to be kind of wet later on, so we don't want to reuse it. We're going to start with a fresh one. 2 baking sheets that are the same sides. We only bake with one, but having two is important for one of the critical steps later on. And then last is just a cheese grater. As I said before, it's much better to buy a brick of cheese than it is to buy pre-shredded cheese. So a cheese grater just means you can actually grate your cheese. While that's in the oven and going, we're going to introduce that delightful little beverage that we can make together. And it's called a shrub. Is typically non-alcoholic beverage that involves some kind of vinegar. I like using apple cider vinegar. There's a lot of folks who sell flavored vinegars. You can often find them at farmers markets. I'm sure they have them at places like Whole Foods. And you can change up your flavor profiles with those different vinegars. And then there's often a syrup, kind of a tart flavor from the vinegar and something sweet from the syrup. I like to use balsamic vinegar for my syrup. Some folks get herb syrup, so you get like a rosemary syrup to add to your shrub. So mine is typically apple cider vinegar and balsamic. We top it with some sparkling water, and we give it a little garnish of some fresh herbs. So it's a beautiful little beverage to mix up for yourself or a few friends who are coming by, especially if either you don't drink or folks are going to be driving soon and you don't want them having drinks, or if you've got some kids around that want to feel a little more adult, but you don't want them actually drinking alcohol. You need, very first thing with this glass is you need to fill it to the top with ice. Some folks, when you tell them this recipe, they'll just throw in a few cubes. It doesn't actually work. The ice is an important measuring mechanism when it comes to mixing cocktails. You'll often hear folks refer to whiskey on the rocks 2 fingers. What that means is it's a glass, ice in it. Bartender measures how much whiskey they put in by the number of fingers that they pour. Now, the amount of whiskey someone gets would change dramatically if there was no ice in there. So the way we measure drinks typically, without having to get a bunch of tools dirty, is we use things like our fingers and the height of them. So in this drink, we're going to fill this with ice all the way to the top. We put in 1 to 2 fingers of apple cider vinegar. It's going to be roughly 1 to 2 ounces of apple cider vinegar. You can adjust it depending on your taste. 2 ounces might be a little strong for some folks. Then we can do a couple dashes of balsamic vinegar. We fill it to the top with sparkling water, and we throw in our little herb garnish. It's really easy. There's no extra tools involved in order to measure. Okay, you can see it's full all the way to the top. The ice is our measuring mechanism here. Without the ice, we pour too much liquid. So we do the ice, and then we use our fingers to measure how much we want. 2 fingers worth of apple cider vinegar here is about 2 ounces. 1 finger is about 1 ounce. I like my apple cider vinegar, so I can go pretty strong. When I make this for my girlfriend, she does not like nearly as much apple cider vinegar, so I just give her 1 finger's worth. Give it a couple dashes of balsamic. We top with our sparkling water. Another thing that's really pretty nice is you can do a little herb garnish. So you could throw some mint on top of this. There on top, it almost looks like a dark mojito. Or another thing that I really love is using fresh rosemary. The oils in this permeate the flavor pretty well. So we're just going to throw that in there and then stir this up a little so all our flavors get mixed. That is a shrub. Nothing too complicated about it. It's a pretty easy beverage, really nice and bright and lovely for summertime, and it comes together very quickly. We are making a cauliflower crust pizza, and this cauliflower crust pizza is an actually good cauliflower crust pizza, and I say that because so many of them are either really soggy when you're done, they fall apart, like they don't have any holding power. So you just have like a bunch of riced cauliflower with pizza stuff on top, or they still contain flour to try to hold it together. So it sort of defeats the purpose of why someone's doing a cauliflower pizza, because it's often to try to get away from gluten. And this one cooks up beautifully and crispy, and it's got a really nice dark color to the crust, which indicates there's a really good amount of flavor going on there. So this is a pretty good recipe. So the next time you're looking for a healthier pizza to make for the family on your Sunday night dinners, you might want to do like a cauliflower pizza crust. And what we've done so far is I took 1.5 pounds, which Whole Foods has a bag of rice cauliflower that's that size. 1.5 pounds of rice cauliflower, spread it over a sheet of parchment paper on a big baking sheet, threw that in the oven at 375, and that's going in there for 15 minutes. I'm going to stir it up, and then there's going to be another 10 minutes back into the oven. We take it out and we let that cool. While that's cooling, we're then going to prep whatever ingredients you want to go on top of your pizza, and some of the stuff that's going to go in with the cauliflower to give it a little bit more of that binding capability so it holds together. Okay, the 15-minute timer just went off. So I'm going to take the rice cauliflower out, just stir it around a little bit, and then give it another 10 minutes. Really, the trick to a good cauliflower crust pizza is getting rid of as much moisture as you can. It helps everything hold together. It helps to get that crispy crust when you're done. Put that back in at 375 for another 10 minutes. What we're trying to do here is just drive out some moisture and soften up the cauliflower so that we can squeeze out even more moisture in the coming steps. So our 10-minute timer just went off, and I'm going to take the cauliflower out. It was in the oven for another 10 minutes. There's still some steam coming off. I'm going to let this rest now for 10 to 15 minutes while we prep the rest of our ingredients that go on top of the pizza and things that we're going to mix with the cauliflower. So we need a good bit of cheese. This is about an 8-ounce brick, which is plenty for both the crust and the toppings. So the crust of this needs at least half a cup. It's probably closer to 3/4 or 1 full cup. I just packed the cup really dense and pile it high because the cheese is one of our binder mechanisms in the crust. It helps hold things together. I'm going to crack an egg here. This also helps bind everything together in our crust. So the cheese and the egg are the two binders that we use. Without them, it doesn't really hold together. So sometimes folks will try to make this vegan. Doesn't really work. Gluten-free, you can do it and you get something that holds together and you can still get a slice. But vegan, not so much. If you've got dried basil, oregano, if you've got dried mixed Italian seasoning, you can use that too. If you really wanted to, you could even add garlic powder to this. We'll just kind of play around with whatever you've got sitting around. Don't add basil, not basil, bay leaves rather, because bay leaves you don't want to eat directly. You only use those in stews and then you take them out. Otherwise, you cut your insides. That's why soups always say add the bay leaf and then remove it later. The bay leaf will break into little shards, and those little shards will kind of cut your intestines a little bit. Then I'm adding 1/4 teaspoon of salt. I'm going to add a similar amount of black pepper and just eyeball it. I'm just going to mix these up real quick. Set them aside for a couple minutes. And so this egg herb mixture and a big dense heaping half cup of mozzarella, which I might even just call 2/3 or 1 cup in the future, is going to be our main binders. So after we squeeze the moisture out of the cauliflower, we then mix it with mozzarella cheese and then our egg. And then we're going to sprinkle a little bit of tapioca starch on top, mix that up, and then we're going to form our pizza crust. So this is where we need one tool you probably have in your kitchen, but it's really important. We need our big thin kitchen towel or a tea towel or flour sack towel. You can use cheesecloth for this. Make sure it's folded over a few times. And be careful because it's got some holes in it. So if you squeeze too much, you might pop out some of the cauliflower. So I prefer a big kitchen towel because it's going to be tougher than the cheesecloth. So I'm just going to transfer all of this into the bowl. And before we start squeezing out the moisture here, you want to actually change the temperature of your oven to 450 because we were doing 375. We're going to need it at 450 in a few minutes. For par baking, which just stands for partially baking crust, and we do that before we put toppings on to again help us control that moisture content. All right, so now is where we start to squeeze out a lot of the moisture. I'm going to pull up these sides, start twisting this. You want to get as much out as you can right now because the more moisture you get out now, the less you have to worry about later when it's baking, and the less moisture there's going to be in your final product. And squeezing the towel really tight helps too. I'm still getting moisture coming out of this. And you can also see how much smaller this ball has gotten, right? This was a lot bigger a couple minutes ago. So I'm almost there. You don't have to keep this liquid. Just go ahead and discard it. And it's now this pretty beautiful, tight, dense lump of fairly dry cauliflower. Like you basically can't add too much mozzarella. So that's why I'm like, a dense heaping cup or half cup rather of mozzarella to this. It's overflowing. You saw how much I squeezed that in. So add that in here. And then We're going to add the egg and break any of the cauliflower chunks as you're doing this, so it all mixes up evenly. Yeah, it's insane how much water comes out of this, even after baking. So you can make a zucchini crust pizza, and you can like shred or spiralize zucchini, mix it with a bunch of egg, and that one you want to bake in the bottom of like a glass dish or a fairly deep pan. So it's almost like a Chicago style pizza or Detroit style pizza. So it's pretty like thickish crust at the bottom. But in order for that to turn out well, you need to do the same process of taking your zucchini and wringing it out. I don't recall if that one you do as much pre-baking or if you just take it raw and do that. I would guess you probably pre-bake it to break up some of the cell structure so it's easier to wring out. But yeah, you get a lot of moisture out of zucchini as well. So I'm going to set this back here. So once it's mixed up, that's when you add your tapioca starch, or about a tablespoon, and just lightly sprinkle across the top. Try to get it fairly even. And this helps take out any extra moisture. It helps with that browning when we bake this up in a little bit. Make sure it's mixing really well so that no one gets any dry tapioca pockets when they're eating the pizza later. Now that that's added, we're going to take all of this and add it to our pan. And here's where we form our pizza crust. And we just do this by hand, so make sure your hands are nice and clean. Get a fairly roundish shape going on and start pressing mostly from the center to push things towards the outside. And while you're doing this, you can help shape the outside by placing your other hand kind of on those edges. Just to give it a little bit of a shape. Now I'm going to keep pressing this out until we got about a 10 to 12 inch pizza crust, which still has a good thickness to it, but it's not so thick that it's, say, uncomfortable. And if you have too much cauliflower on one side, like I've got a little more up here than I do down here, you could take some and pick it up there and just add it to the bottom side. But pressing it here helps a bit with forming our crust and holding together. And then it also helps just create the shape that we want. So yeah, definitely a lot more crust up here than at the bottom. And just make sure that you give some support to the outside edge, not necessarily because we're making like the lip for anything, because we do flip this, but more so because if we have ragged edges, they're going to cook a bit faster than everything else. And it just makes them slightly more prone to burning. So by just forming up the edges a little bit more, we help protect ourselves from burning, but we get some really good browning. Our oven is preheated to 450. And what we're going to do is, like this, we're going to throw this into the oven. We're going to par bake this, so partially bake it, for 20 minutes. Then we're going to flip it over, and I'm going to show you exactly how we flip it over. We can just chat until then. And then going to bake it for another 10 minutes and then put our toppings on. So again, 450, 20 minutes. This 20 minutes is a perfect time to get any dishes you've already made cleaned up or prep any more toppings for your pizza. While we've got the time here, I'm just prepping a few more ingredients to go on top of the pizza. I'm going to be making a pizza that is more so to my girlfriend's flavor profile tonight, which means jalapenos and pineapple, and some mushroom on top. So see, like, this is a very traditional mushroom shape. But yeah, so I've got these, some mushrooms, some pineapple, jalapenos are gonna go on there. I've already got my red sauce, plenty of mozzarella is already grated up. So we've got about 15 minutes left on the crust on its first go through. And then I'm gonna teach you how to flip the crust. This was another thing, Austin, you're asking about how I develop the recipes and where I pull stuff from. This was another thing that I didn't see anyone else call out. They said to flip it, but they didn't show you how. And I noticed a lot of the comments from people who followed the recipes were asking about it. And I have a feeling, and even so, the folks who had some of the recipes that I looked at to base this off of, they even had videos showing you how to do it, but they conveniently didn't show you how to flip the crust. I think it's because they had trouble doing it, or they didn't have confidence in the method that they used. So for us, I have total confidence in how we're going to do this. I know exactly how we're going to flip this crust. It works perfectly every time. And it's something that I learned in pottery, which is why I call it the potter's method. Because if you don't use this method, especially when you're making things like bowls, you will ruin your piece. So it's a really simple concept. It's really easy if you've got two pans that are the same size. If you don't, have one pan that's smaller than the other and have that be the second pan, so the one that's not in the oven. And you can still do this flip method, but it's practically foolproof. So we'll see what that looks like in 13 minutes here. I used to buy rolls of parchment paper. I don't do that anymore. I buy sheets of parchment paper on Amazon and get a pack of 100 for like $10 or something. This has made life so much easier. It's one of those purchases that you don't think about, or you don't think it's going to make a very big difference, and as soon as you do it, it's a game changer. So sheets, pre-cut sheets of parchment paper, buy them on Amazon rather than the grocery store. In the grocery store, they're very expensive. On Amazon, they're very cheap. These things are awesome. So this is what our crust looks like right now. There's still some more baking it's going to do in our oven, but we have to flip it. Flipping it like this is going to be tough. We could slide a spatula under there, but it's still pretty flexible. We might break it. We're actually very likely going to break it. So what we're going to do is we're going to use something called the potter's method. So I've got two pans here that are the same size. I'm going to just slide this so it's right in the middle. I'm going to take this other sheet of parchment paper I just grabbed, set it on top of that crust, take this sheet and nest it on top. We want it nested so that this has direct contact with that crust. And then I'm going to use two towels. You can use some pot holders. I'm going to grab either end of this so that it's supported. And then I'm going to flip it over. Now, this top pan is still very hot, so be careful when you pick it up. Flip that back over. Got a perfectly flipped crust, and then we can use this new sheet of parchment paper, slide it back onto the already hot pan so we don't slow down our cooking time, and then put it right back into the oven. We're almost there, and you got to see how much color was already going on that crust, on that flip before. You don't get that much color if you don't use a starch and if you don't remove enough moisture. Our crust is now going to be ready to add the toppings. Now, an important step here is to actually leave the crust on the pan. And because we're leaving it on the pan, just be careful, it's going to be very hot still. So on the countertop or wherever you're going to add your toppings, just make sure you lay down some trivets or some towels or something to protect your countertop. And be careful of your fingers or any little fingers that might be around wanting to touch the pizza a little early. So this is our crust. We haven't topped it yet. We're still going to give it a little more time in the oven, but a lot of the moisture has already been driven off. We can see how dry and crispy some of these edges have already gotten. Some of that's the cheese, some of that's the starch, some of that's the cauliflower. When it comes to red sauce, so you can make your own pizza sauce in like 5 minutes or less. You get a can of crushed tomatoes. You add some garlic paste to it. You add maybe a little bit of water, some basil, some oregano. There's probably a few other seasonings to add. Blend it up in a blender real quick and you've got tomato sauce. You can also just kind of use whatever red sauce you like. It's not all that picky. You could make a fancy tomato sauce for pizzas specifically, but if you're just trying to make dinner, having a red sauce is totally sufficient. Make sure they didn't add any sugar. There's no reason sugar needs to be added into your tomato sauce. Some mushrooms on here. Jalapenos. But you can put whatever you like. You can put pepperoni. You can put sausage. You can put peppers. You can put onions. The biggest thing we're looking for, and one of the reasons why this ends up going in the oven for another 15 minutes, 10 to 15, but probably closer to 15, is we want these things to be cooking in the oven and get some color. I can try just use my hand. But if we don't give it enough time, these things don't cook, so we don't get to pull out extra flavors from our mushrooms and our jalapenos. So all we're really aiming for or rather a good sign that it's been in the oven long enough, is you want your cheese to be pretty brown and bubbly. Okay, plenty of pineapple. This is going to go back in the oven for another 10 to 15 minutes, probably closer to 15. You can see the coloration on the mushrooms, some of the jalapenos, some of the pineapple is starting to change coloration on some of the edges. We've got this really beautiful crispy crust on the edges too. So this is going to hold together really well when we slice it in just 2 to 3 minutes.